all, the begging poor, the one who is absolutely helpless. It depicts all of that. It's very strong language. Now that is true when you come into verse 6, the hunger and thirst. So the hunger and thirst is more like starving to death. It's more like, I can't stand this. It's very, very severe language. Last time we talked about this, we gave quite a paragraph on what it was to be thirsty, because thirst seems to be dominant in the progression of hunger and thirst. And I just want to kind of refresh just a few statements about that kind of description. Because as you walk into this, it's absolutely essential that you keep in mind, that you have in your grasp, in your thought process, what this thirst is like that he's talking about. For instance, in the paragraph that we shared with you about what thirst was all about, the saliva becomes thick and foul tasting. The tongue begins to cling to the teeth and the mouth, the roof of the mouth. The face begins to feel full because of the shrinking of the skin. Most people begin to hallucinate, describing the idea of thirst. Now, probably all of us here, I would guess this morning, would say, well, we've never been in that kind of condition. And that would probably be true for a large majority that we might talk to. That we've never ever been to that state of thirst. But I would like to somehow remove the physical thought process of that and take you into the spiritual realm. I think you felt that in your spiritual life. I think if you could see, which is the picture he's painting, remember? I think if you could see this in the spiritual realm of your own life, you would say, oh, man, I have been there. I have been so deprived of spiritual value and spiritual warmth and his presence and all that I needed in terms of grace. I've been so far removed. And maybe you want to say, well, I certainly haven't been there, because if you're like I am, I was raised in the church. I've always been in church. I've always been surrounded by people who prayed and hymns and worship. But I identify with this. The depth of spiritual hunger that just says, I can't stand where I am, that I've been deprived of all that makes me whole, all that gives me the warmth of love and makes me the person that God has dreamed I should be. I've been deprived of that, and I hunger and I thirst for that. Is that a possibility for you? And when you get into the progression, you understand it's the helplessness, this fourth beatitude. You look at it, the one that's of hunger and thirst, you look at it and say, how could that possibly be in light of the other beatitudes? For instance, you start out with the helplessness, but all the helplessness are embraced by his unlimited resource, and they literally become the kingdom of God. And you move into the verse 4, the second beatitude, and out of that helplessness there comes a mourning, which is the response that I have towards God that allows him to embrace me and bring his unlimited resource of his person to my very being, so that fullness is really mine. And I find that the Comforter himself has literally wrapped his arms around me and brought the comfort that I need. And of course in verse 5, the third beatitude, it's his nature is literally beginning to spill through me, and the core of what he is and his meekness has literally begun to spill through me until my whole physical existence begins to take on a whole new kind of ownership. I literally inherit it. And when you get at that point, you move into this fourth beatitude and say, where do you get hungering and thirsting out of that? Because you'd think you'd move into the fourth beatitude and say, oh, am I ever full? Because my helplessness has been met by his unlimited grace and strength, and My mourning has been comforted by the very indwelling of the Spirit, and His nature is literally permeating me, and I own the physical world. How do you get hunger and thirst? But if you ask that question this morning, that tells me that you have not really meant Him. I don't know how to explain this to you. But somehow when you meet Him, it's like the hunger increases. It's like He expands on you. It's like revelation begins to take place, and you take a bite of Him, and you eat of His flesh and drink of His blood, and somehow in that tasting of Him, there begins to be an unfolding of a whole new arena, a whole new clearness of what He's all about, and all of a sudden your capacity enlarges, and you say, oh, I got to have that, and you bite again, and oh, it begins to, and there's just this increasing kind of did that make any sense? So it's like you're living in this is not a negative, you understand, this is a positive, because this keeps me focused on Him. This keeps me driven in my inner being just to devour Him, to be filled with Him, to know Him in intimacy. See, this is a good thing. So what He's giving us in this fourth beatitude is not a downer. It's a pulling us in and saying, oh, if you can get into this will drive you into the spiritual depth. This will bring you into a whole realm of living that you never dreamed possible. And it's the fullness of who He is. And even when we talk about fullness, it's an expanding fullness itself. Blessed, congratulations, those of you who hunger, starve to death for Him. Because you're experiencing something of fullness. Now, what we want to get into this morning is the fact that the hungering and thirsting is not focused on Jesus. Well, it is. Well, no. It's focused on righteousness. But what we're going to find out is righteousness is Him. So it's really a focus on Him. So we're going to talk about this righteousness thing. And of course, the Greek word is dikaiosine, which is an interesting word. And this is going to be a little technical, which is going to be difficult for some of you. But please try to hang with us. The Greek word dikaiosine is literally the last part. Did you note the four last letters of it? Sine. In the Greek language, when they put those four letters on the end of the word, it indicates it's an abstraction, which immediately makes it difficult. If you go to the grammar, you find out that it's in the feminine gender, which again tells you it's an abstraction. See, you've got the masculine and you've got the feminine. The masculine is concrete, solid, hit it, grab it, measure it, devour it, understand it, get a hold of it, master it. Feminine is abstract. Can't figure it out. Don't know what's going to happen next. I see I'm getting into trouble here. Which is really an interesting struggle in life. Because I'm a concrete kind of guy. I'm a masculine kind of guy. I know I don't look like much, but I'm a masculine kind of guy. My whole approach to life is masculine. See, if there's a problem, if something doesn't work, we'll get a hammer. We'll kick the thing. Well, come on. Don't stand over there and blubber. Get over here. Let's get at it. That's a masculine approach. But the abstract, what I'm finding out is the things that are most valuable in life are found in the abstract feminine. Prayer is an abstract. It's always in the feminine gender in the New Testament. Prayer. Because you can't quite get a hold of it. Does prayer work? Well, I believe it does. Well, prove it. I can't. Well, take all the times you've prayed and got an answer. Take all the times you've prayed and you think you didn't get an answer and evaluate. Does it work? Does it not? Is it worth it? How much prayer do you have to do? How many hours really works? How much time? That can't even be discussed. Because when you pray, God answers. Does he always answer? I don't know. Wouldn't it be something if he didn't answer your prayer because you are asking for a dumb thing, and he's so smart he doesn't give you what you ask for and goes beyond what you need and goes on what you think you need and gives you far greater, and you didn't even know it. And so he answered your prayer. You were too dumb to know it. So how are you going to evaluate? Does it work? I don't know. Can you prove it? I can't prove it, but I believe it works. It's abstract. Love. It's an abstraction. Well, why don't you go down to Family Dollar and buy some? You can't. You can go down to the corner and get a prostitute, but you can't buy love. Well, what is it when you get it? I don't know. How do you describe it? Well, we've tried to describe it. It's the ability to use somebody else's toothbrush. I don't think that gets to the bottom of it. You know, I really don't think that hacks it. I don't think that really pulls through with the definition. I mean, I don't know what it is, but I do not want to be without it in my life. I got to have this, whatever it is. Righteousness, see, is in that category. And you can't. What are we going to talk about as we talk? Are you going to get any of this? Do I understand even what I don't know? Wow, righteousness. Let's begin with a description of righteousness. And we're going to try to just walk through this carefully and see what we can get a hold of. In the Old Testament and in the New Testament, the description of righteousness is identical. Now, what's different in the New Testament is the contextual experience of righteousness is different than the contextual experience of righteousness in the Old Testament. In other words, the definition in the Old Testament and the definition in the New Testament of righteousness is exactly, the description of it is exactly the same. But when you experience it in the Old Testament, it has one kind of content. When you experience it in the New Testament, it has an altogether different context or content. So while they're described the same, they are different in their quality. Okay. In the Old Testament and the New Testament, righteousness is conceived by God. He is the one who started it. He is the one who commands it. He is the one who calls us to this standard of righteousness. Man does not invent this. This is not going to be judged by man, which is the second idea you come up with as you view the description. One is that God conceived it, God started it, He's the one who's commanding it, He calls us to the high standard, and He is the one who controls it. So righteousness is always controlled by God. In other words, God is the one who's going to test you, judge you, determine whether you are or whether you are not. This is not a comparison with each other. This is not a comparison in how much. This is not quantity of deeds done. This is going to be determined by God, who has set the standard for righteousness and is calling us to that standard, and He's going to be the judge of whether you meet that standard or not. It is also concluded by God, because contained within the standard of righteousness is who He is. In other words, righteousness literally spills out of the essence of his own nature. In other words, God is not over here and he came up with this idea about what he wanted you to be, but it has nothing to do with what he is. That is not the case. God, in his own inner nature, literally came up with the idea of who he is. It spills out of the core of his own system, and he comes to you and says, oh, I want you to be like I am, which is holy and righteous. You run into these statements like Leviticus 11:44. For I am the Lord your God. You know these verses. For I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore consecrate yourself, and you shall be holy, for I am holy. So you say, what's the standard of holiness and righteousness? Oh, it's God. I'm to be holy as he is holy. This is not do what I tell you. This is be who I am. So that the righteousness spills out of the internal nature of God himself, who is calling you to a likeness, to a similarity, to the standard of his own person. So the righteousness is not the standard of a law, it's the standard of his very nature itself. Now, 1 Peter 1:16, which we're not going to look at, also quotes that Old Testament. So it's not only verified, it's not only in the Old Testament, it's verified in the New Testament. And if you say, well, then God wants me to be like he is, yes. But you have to understand who he is. Well, God is omnipresent. I know, but he's never invited you to get in on that. So if you want to be everywhere at one time, forget it. Angels are not that way. You're not that way. Only God is omnipresent. The devil is not that way, and you're never going to be that way. And if you've got your mind set on that, bug off, because it's none of your business. He's never invited you to become like that. God is omniscient, all-knowing. He's never invited you to be all-knowing, although you've been trying to be. He's never invited you, and some of you think you are, but he's never invited you to be all-knowing. He's never invited you to be a part of that. Nobody is all-knowing but God. That is his characteristic. Omnipotent, all-powerful. He's never invited you to be all-powerful. He alone is all-powerful. Nobody else is. And that's limited to him. And he's drawn a line, and you can't get in on that. But get a hold of this. God and the Trinity has cracked himself open and said, oh, why don't you come and be a part of my nature? Why don't you come and get on the essence of my heart? Why don't you come and be a part of my nature? Why don't you come and get into my mind and into my inner soul and become a part of the very core of my system? And God has invited you to take on his nature. And it is holy, righteous. Now, in an Old Testament contextual experience, that spilled out in the law. For a holy God said, if you want to know what that means, I am a holy God, I will show you. And he gave us the law. And the law was how God would live if he were in your shoes. So if I'm going to be holy like God is, I'm going to have to do these things. And it was self-sourced. This was not bad. This was good. The law was not evil. The law was right. In fact, Romans 7:12 and 13. Therefore, the law is holy. And the commandment, holy and just and good. Has then what is good become death to me? Certainly not. Well, what happened? Sin. That it might appear sin was producing death in me through what is good, so that sin through the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. Well, what's going on here? What on earth is he saying? The law is good. Old Testament structure, contextual experience. The law is good. We live in this law. And here it's right, it's good, God gave it, nothing wrong with it. But the minute I tried to keep it, it became, not it, I became sinful. Because I was attempting to keep the law out of my own sinful nature. And the law is only holy as it is holy in his nature. And the minute self-sourcing, self-sufficiency, I out of myself attempt to do this, it literally produces sin. So what was good ended up destroying me. Oh, not it, but the sin that was contained within the attempt to do it. Did that make any sense? A little confusing. That's a tough concept. For instance, if you look at Isaiah 64:6, this might help. We are all like an unclean thing. All our righteousnesses are like filthy rags. Wow. Do you realize what that says? That says, here's the law of God, and every attempt I make to keep the law of God is my own righteousness, which is filthy rags, which in itself is sin. So every time I attempted to do the right thing out of myself, every time I attempted to do the right thing without him, every time I attempted to do the right thing out of self-sufficiency, every time I attempted to do the right thing independent from him, it literally ended up to be sin. So my best deed on my best day, wrapped around my best attitude, is filth. The law isn't bad, but all my attempts to keep the law ended up bad. So what chance do I have to be righteous in all of this? What a dilemma. Old Testament context. Now Jesus is bringing this into the New Testament context. Look at this thing. 6 times in the 6 times in the New Testament this word shows up, this word righteousness. 4 times it's in the Sermon on the Mount. One of them obviously is right here. He starts out with the one we're looking at, which is in the Beatitudes. Hunger and thirst for righteousness. He moves you to the last Beatitude, which is verse 10, brings it up again, and it is about persecution. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. You didn't think that being filled with the nature of God and allowing him to live through you and producing this holiness within you was going to be acceptable among people who are filled with their own selves. Did you? You didn't think that for one single moment everybody was going to pat you on the back and encourage you to live in the presence of God and let him spill all through you. Did you? Didn't you know the very nature of God that rolls through your system, emanates in your being, produces your living now, that makes you holy, is going to be an extreme irritation to everybody around you who doesn't want that? So persecution is the result? Absolutely. In fact, he moves on to the next time that he uses this word, which is verse 20 of this same chapter, and he says, for I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds there is super abundantly. So your righteousness, he says, in the New Testament context. In other words, Old Testament, New Testament, the description is the same, but the context in which this lives is vastly different. In the Old Testament, it's the law. But every time I attempt to keep that, I am in a failure mood because, oh, my righteousness are filthy rags. Now he says, come into the New Testament, which is the flow of his Spirit, the embrace of his person, the helpless who mourns and experiences the embrace of the person of Jesus that literally becomes one with God, and he begins to spill through me, which means, verse 20, for I say to you that unless your righteousness superly, abundantly exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you can't even get into the kingdom. Don't you understand? The least in the kingdom is way beyond this. Now think this through. How on earth could you tithe better than the Pharisees? I mean, a tithe is a tithe. And if you tithe, you tithe. How could you super abundantly tithe? I mean, if you are at church every time the church doors are open, which they did, how on earth could you go to church more than that? Super abundantly go to church more than them. If you met all the requirements of prayer and prayed every time you were supposed to pray, as they did, how could you super abundantly exceed their righteousness? If you kept all the laws as you're supposed to keep them, how could you super abundantly? See, that's because it's not a doing performance context now. It's an embrace relational context, which is not about quantity of deeds done. It's about quality of intimacy experienced. Yes! Isn't that phenomenal? That wasn't what was a struggle and what was an attempt, which always failed because my righteousness is filthy rags, and I never had righteousness, never experienced the quality of his nature here by all of my doing and all of my struggling and all my attempting. In the intimacy with Jesus, suddenly it all became mine because the fullness of his Spirit and the flow of his very nature literally began to permeate my system, and I didn't do holy things. I became holy in quality of nature. And the immediate result of that, ladies and gentlemen, is chapter 6, verse 33, where he uses this word the fourth time and says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. So that this quality of nature becomes the hungering passion of my soul. Oh, to be like him. If I could just be like him, if I could just get intimate with him, if I could just know him as he is, if I could just align my life with his very character until all that he is begins to literally drip into my system, flood through my being, burn in my bones, move through my very thought process, and I could take on the mind of Christ, and I would be righteous. Congratulations! You hunger and thirst for this, who he is. The delineation of righteousness. Let's look at that. Keep this whole description in mind now. And let's move back into the hunger and thirst. The hungering and thirsting is focused on the righteousness. It is the cry of the heart that says, oh, I've got to be like him. You know what I'd like to see out of you? You know what I'd like to see on your face? You know what I'd like to hear escaping your lips? I would like to hear this cry from the deep of your inner heart that says, oh, if I could be like him. It's interesting in that chapter 10 that Jesus talks about ministry, and in that discourse of ministry, he says, it is enough. It is enough. Meaning, oh, this would be, oh, I could die happy if this could happen. Oh, if this one thing could take place. Oh, this would be the fulfillment of all my bucket list. This would be the whole deal if this one thing could take place. If I could just be righteous, like him, know him, filled with his nature. Oh, to be like him. In fact, we dealt with it last night somewhat in the Saturday night service. In the Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 verse. His whole invitation is, come to me, all you who labor. See, you've been laboring in this Old Testament contextual experience of trying to be like him. You've labored until you are exhausted. You are worn out. You've tried so hard, haven't you? You've done your best. Life is still, you haven't made it. Oh, I see that, he says. You're worn out. In fact, he says, you're heavy laden. It's like freight put on a ship. They've just burdened you down with all this stuff you've got to do in order to be righteous, and you've just labored under this. You've carried it. This has been like a ball and chain around your ankle. You've been dragging this through life. It's whipped you. It's worn you out. He says, oh, come to me. Would you just come? And I'll pick you up in my arms. And everything you've been looking for in the laboring of this experience will literally begin to fill you. And you will know me and be righteous. He describes this in his last sermon in Matthew chapter 23. And you don't need to turn there, but this is the last preached sermon of Jesus. Listen to these words. He says, you know what you've been experiencing? They bind heavy burdens hard to bear. They lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one little finger. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. He says, don't you know what's going on over here? They take all this stuff and heap it on you and just burden you down, and you are just weighed down with this awful load of this is all in order to meet up to the standard. He says, don't you understand what the standard? Come to the New Testament, man. Embrace my person. Let me fill you. Oh, come to me. I will give you rest. Don't you know my yoke is easy? My burden is light. Come on. What are you struggling for? Embrace. Embrace. Now, not only is the focus of the hungering and thirst on the righteousness to be like him, but there is a filling of righteousness. And this is where some of the difficulty comes in the Beatitude. And I want to try to walk you through this. Just beginning. Congratulations are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Now, I know how you would picture, at least I would picture hungering. I'm hungry, famished. I sit down. Here is the Chinese buffet. I can see it coming. And I eat. I'm filled. I'm not hungry anymore. What I was deprived of has now been sufficiently put within me, and I am no longer hungry. So I am filled. The difficulty is I become hungry again. So obviously, in the analogy of physical hunger and thirst, putting it into the context of righteousness, are we filled and not hungry anymore? In fact, I may even overeat. Is this a prediction? I am a prophet. I may overeat at the Chinese buffet. And I may walk out of this saying, I will never eat again. Never. Which you know isn't true. Even though all of us have said it at times, it is not true. We will eat again. We will be hungry again. So is this a temporary filling? Am I going to eat and be filled, eat and be filled, eat and be filled, be hungry, eat, filled, hungry, eat, filled, hungry? What is he trying to say in this passage? Now this is a little technical, which will bless you. Normally, in the Scriptures, follow this, this is not that hard. Normally, this is phenomenal. You got to get this. Normally, in the Scriptures, hunger and thirst is followed by a word, in this case, righteousness, which is in the genitive. A genitive establishes relationship between two words. For instance, I hunger for pie. Pie is in the genitive, establishing relationship, and it's always partial. Meaning, I don't hunger for the whole pie. I just want a piece. Well, 2 pieces? Well, maybe half of it. But I don't want the whole thing, because I know I couldn't eat the whole thing. So when it's in the genitive, which normally in the Scriptures it is, I am hungry for pie. Genitive, pie would be in the genitive, which means partial. I just would like a big chunk. I don't want the whole thing, just a big chunk. Okay. When you come to this passage, this is so phenomenal. When you come to this passage, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. You would expect righteousness to be in the genitive, meaning I just want part of the righteousness. It is not. It is in the accusative, which is like a direct object, which means I don't want part of the righteousness. I want all the righteousness. I hunger for it all. Which changes everything in the passage. Because it is a hunger for the completeness of all that he is. Realizing I don't even know all that he is. But there is this hunger because I've tasted and he's grown larger and my capacity is increased. And I've tasted and he's grown larger and my capacity increases. I've tasted, he grows larger and my capacity increases. And I live in this. I live in this. The finite has literally got a hold of the infinite and is literally being sucked into it and never is filled, and yet always is filled. And I'm being filled with a continual hunger going on in my life. I'm living in a dissatisfied satisfaction that literally constantly keeps me focused on him and drives me because I know I've got to have more. Why? Because there is so much more to get. He is so much bigger than what I dreamed. He is so far beyond what I've ever expected. I had no idea. I thought I could just come, kneel at an altar of prayer. He'd pat me on the head. That would be the end of it. But this thing exploded in my life. It's the very essence of his nature that literally draws me. And I hunger and thirst. Now the determination then of the hunger and thirst is, that is healthy. If you never get hungry, we say, oh, you're sick. Things aren't right. So it's healthy. See, this is contrary to this setup over here. Because this setup over here in the Old Covenant was the kind of setup we have as we look at each other. We see, hey, we're really overfed and we're a little overweight and we sit in power and everything we need is ours and everything's going well and the job and the finances, and we look at each other and say, congratulations, you're filled. This is the opposite of that. Congratulations, you're hungry. And why are you hungry? Not because you're not being filled. Why are you hungry? Because this Jesus is so big, he's expanding in your life. And in the expanse, you are being drawn. Is this happening in your life? If not, you're not healthy. You're not healthy. Jesus, have I been so self-sufficient, so filled with myself? Have I been living contextually in the contextual experience of the old covenant? Have I been seeing righteousness as only the system of my own accomplishment? Have I been seeing it in quantity rather than the quality of your presence? Have I measured it by my doing instead of felt it, experienced it, embraced it in the quality of your presence? Have I looked at your righteousness and hungered for part? Have I approached it with the attitude of enough to get by? It's what I wanted. Just enough to solve my problems. Just enough to get to heaven. Oh, would you let me see you today? Would you reveal yourself to me today? Would you flood your way into my life? Would you beat on my door? Until in seeing you, I would hunger for all. My cry would be all. You are the driving force of my life. You are what burns in my bones, what floods in my bloodstream. You are the passion, the hungering passion. Oh, to know your mind. Oh, to have the mind of Christ. Oh, to embrace your emotions. Oh, to feel like you feel. Oh, to want what you want. Oh, to care about what you care about. Oh, I long, dear Jesus, I long to see things as you see them. To be righteous as you are righteous. Heads are bowed. A lot of people are worse than I am, preacher. That isn't even in this conversation. I do pretty good in most things. That's not even under discussion. I'm honest. Faithful to the church. It's not under our consideration. This is not quantity. Let me ask you about the quality of your embrace, the intimacy of your love with Him. Let me ask you about the tightness of your thought process with His. Would you give expression this morning to hungering and thirsting for that which He is? A God who's cracked Himself wide open and has said, come, be a part of my heart, be a part of what I am within, be a part of my nature, be a part of how I feel. Embrace me here. Let me fill you. Let's seek Him together today. Our altar is open. Be obedient to His call.